Chapter 9, Part 2. So we're continuing on with the psychoanalytic approach to personality. We are starting here, number 3, with the structure of the personality. Id, ego, superego, and the interaction of how they work together. Okay. I'm sure you all have somewhat of a base in these concepts, but I think there'll be some new information in here for you to learn. So we'll do that, and we're also going to do dynamics of personality, types of anxiety and defense mechanisms, and we'll stop there and do the psychosexual stages in the next video. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so before we get into the id and the ego and the superego and all of those pieces, just review. Psychoanalytic perspectives concerns how people cope with their sexual and aggressive instincts within the constraints of a civilized society, right? So you've got these drives, these sexual drives, these aggressive drives, and we're going to be looking at how those work and then how people work to control those, work within them. So back to that plumbing system metaphor that we used in the former video. Mind is a plumbing system, contains water under pressure. It's constant pressure. The pressure is a metaphor for the energy from the instincts, which builds up, and it builds up and demands release. So there are 3 pieces in there, 3 plumbers, as they're giving the metaphor for. So one plumber, which is the id, when there's all this pressure builds up, the id just wants to open up all the valves, right? Just open them all up without a thought in the world. The superego wants to keep everything closed, very, very protected. Everything stays closed. And the ego is in the middle, trying to figure out ways to work between the id and the superego, trying to redirect the pressure. You're trying to relieve the strain, but you don't want to make a mess. The ego is balancing between these 2 somewhat crazy extremes. Little visual here. So the id, driven by unconscious need for pleasure. Pleasure principle is what it works by. And it is present at birth. Immediate gratification. I want it now. Out of control. The ego develops around the age 2, works on the reality principle. It's trying to reduce conflict between these 2. Okay, so it's trying to be reasonable. And it's the piece that implements these defense mechanisms that we're going to talk about later. And then finally, the superego, which is crazy on the other extreme, develops around the age of 5. It's our internal morality. You usually learn this from like your parents, your teachers, authority figures around you. So anyways, it that punishes our ego for any wrong through guilt. Okay, so everything has to be perfect and moral but like way off the charts, right? And it is what has people, say, feeling guilty or embarrassed, controls people in that sense. Okay, so just a little deeper on these points. The id is the most primitive part of the mind. It's the sources of all drives and urges. As I said, it works on the pleasure principle. So that is the desire for immediate gratification. Just imagine like a baby, like a child, right? Like, well, not a baby, like 1 or 2. They want what they want and they want it now. And if they don't get it, they start screaming. Like there's no reasoning with them. Nothing. They just want, they're impulsive. You say selfish, but they don't know anything else but to think of themselves. They don't listen to reason. It does not listen to reason. It has no values, no morals, no patience, nothing. Just give it to me right now. So it functions according to primary process thinking, which is thinking without rules. There's no rules. It's just what you want. One thing they talk about is wish fulfillment. And what that is that sometimes what the id wants is not readily available. It's not right there. So because it's not right there and they want it right now and they're, freaking out, they imagine or create this image of what they want. And it sort of temporarily satisfies them for that time being, until they can, get what they want. That is wish fulfillment. The next piece is ego. The ego constrains into reality. It develops. It's the second part to develop. And as I said, it operates according to the reality principle, which is you can't just have whatever you want. Okay, there's rules, there's social expectations, there's things that you can do, and there's things that you can't. Expressions of id must be avoided, redirected, or postponed. So it is just basically trying to manage the id. It operates according to secondary process thinking. It's trying to solve problems. It's trying to think of other strategies to make the id to behave in a slightly more realistic way, a more moral way, acceptable way. Works to postpone the discharge of id urges until an appropriate situation arises. So, example is, one child and another child are not getting along, wanting to fight, and the id may want to, smack that other child in the face, but you're not allowed to do that. That's not okay. So the ego would say, okay, you can't punch them in the face. Why don't you just tease them or call them a name? It's trying to sort of behave in a little bit more okay, excuse my grammar, in a more okay way, rather than the out of control way that the id actually wants to behave in. Superego. This Ed Flanders sort of represents it well here. It is the third part of the mind to develop, around 5 years old, internalizes ideals, values, moral of society. You learn this from your parents, your teachers, from church, from any sort of form of authority, where you're learning right and wrong behaviors. Some refer to it as the conscience, main tool of the superego in enforcing right and wrong and the emotion of guilt. Yeah. So it enforces itself by, if you do the wrong thing, you're going to feel guilt, shame, or embarrassment. Like the id, it's not bound by reality. So that's why I said, the id is crazy to one extreme, and superego is crazy to the other. They're just on opposite ends of the continuum, and the ego's in the middle trying to balance the two. So impossibly high standards, perfectionist, unrealistic. So superego is equal to the conscious. Oh, it divides into two pieces, right? The conscience plus the ego ideal. So it's operating on two levels, well, considering two pieces, I should say it that way. It operates according to what society says is right and what is wrong. Society, your parents, what do they say is right or wrong? What have you learned? But then also, what is ideal for yourself? So it's balancing those two pieces. This is the piece with the plumbing analogy. When there's a desire to do something, while the id just wants to jump and do it, open up all the valves and jump, the superego wants to keep all the valves closed. And if it could add more valves to contain you even more, it would. Interaction of the id, the ego, and the superego. They're in constant interaction, right? Little conversations always going on in your head. Different goals, so constant internal conflict and anxiety, right? So all day long we're coming across different decisions and different things, or different things that we want to do. Anxiety is something that's not right, expressed as, yeah. So when they're in turmoil, when you're bouncing between the id, the ego, and the superego, you're going to feel anxiety. Okay. Anxiety is the sign that something is not right. So the id is pulling, or the superego is pulling. It's not balancing. So you feel anxiety or internal conflict. Sometimes it's expressed as physical symptoms. You get rapid heart rate, smarty palms, sweaty palms, a panic feeling. The ego balances. When the ego balances, therefore a sign of a well-balanced mind, free from anxiety. Okay. Think of an example when your id, your superego were battling and the ego tries to balance between the two. So this would be fun to do in class. So I thought of one, fairly innocent one, but I think it's a good one. Has to do with, and it's the right time of year, has to do with Halloween. When my kids would come home with their big bags of chocolate. And they'd dump them all down and they'd play with their chocolate, and then they would go to bed and they would leave the bags right there. So my id was all over that. I so badly wanted to eat all of that chocolate. Yeah. But then I've got my superego, probably like my super mom ego, that's saying, Laura, like, God, it's not yours. This is your children's Halloween chocolate. It is so wrong of you to eat it all while they're sleeping. You know. So in the end, every year my ego, of course, wins out, and I balance it by eating a little bit from each child's chocolate bag. So it's balanced, right? Just a couple of pieces for mom from each kid, and makes it feel okay. So that's one example of, and that's, you have these situations all day, every day. When you see money laying on the ground and you're like, you really want to take it. Or your superego saying, maybe you should look around, somebody's missing that. Like, it's just constant all day, right? Okay. Oop. There we go. So that's the structure. Now we're going to look at dynamics of personality, types of anxiety, and then the defense mechanisms. Signal that control of the ego is being threatened by reality. Yeah, so we talked about this. You get this anxious feeling because things are out of balance. They talk about 3 different types of anxiety. Objective anxiety is external. I put these green here. It's real. It's real. If you're walking down the street and some spooky kind of dark figures walking in your same direction, that is an objective anxiety. It's real. It occurs in real response to a real threat to a person. Neurotic and moral anxiety, they are internal. So neurotic anxiety is when there's a direct conflict between the id and the ego, and you're worried, you think the id's going to win, and you're going to do that naughty thing, right? That thing you're not supposed to, but you really want to. That's neurotic anxiety. Moral anxiety, of course, is between the id and the superego. Moral anxiety results in feeling like you're never good enough. So the superego is very powerful, so you feel like you're never good enough. You end up with low self-esteem because you can never measure up to what you're supposed to be. You're not smart enough. You're not attractive enough. You should be more of this. You should be doing better in school. You should be doing more of this. Anyways, that's moral anxiety. So we're going to talk about defense mechanisms next, and defense mechanisms are mechanisms, tools, strategies that your ego engages in order to defend against these anxieties. Yeah. So they can successfully defend and never consciously feel the anxiety. That is the goal. Okay, because you don't really do it consciously. Your ego does it to save you from feeling the anxiety. You'll see too is repression, because they actually talk about conversion reaction in the first paragraph, but they don't label that as one. So I'm labeling it as number one, kind of. So conversion reaction. This is when the conflict is converted into a symptom, like a headache, and the symptom helps to avoid the anxiety. So, yeah, I don't know, stress about something, when you're feeling you start to feel really anxious, and your ego turns it into a headache or a sore leg or turns it into some physical symptom. And now you're just thinking, oh, I've got a headache or I've got a really sore leg. And you're not thinking about that anxiety. Okay. And it's unconscious. So number 2 is repression. This is the one, you probably heard probably most about this one. This is where the ego takes the issue or the anxiety, the provoking situation, and basically represses it right down into the unconscious, so that you don't know that it's there. Yeah, it's about as simple as that. Taking the anxiety, suppress it. You don't have to deal with it. Of course, that's the one that we were talking about earlier, that they deal with in psychoanalytic counseling, because those repressed feelings and urges and wants, they will come to the surface, or they will guide your behavior in some way later in adulthood. A little bit later, it mentions, so Anna Freud was Freud's daughter, and she was also a psychoanalyst, and she was very much engaged in doing research on defense mechanisms, and she had a lot to do with this next group. So Freud really took it up to repression, and then she sort of became involved and helped discover other ways that we other ways, as defense mechanism that we use in order to deal with the stresses of everyday life. Okay, so the first one is denial, and that's just saying, that's straight up denying, like things are just not that way, right? What could we say? People who smoke, even though there's all the evidence in the world that it's going to kill them, they're like, well, it's not going to kill me, or who wants to live forever anyways. There's lots, like maybe there's a divorce, and the one partner doesn't want to deal with why the other person left. It may have had anything to do with them or whatever, so they will deny that it had anything to do with them and come up with a reason why that person left. Like, they're not looking at the facts, they're just making stuff up and denying the reality of what's going on. Okay. So fundamental attribution error is the tendency to blame events outside of one's control for the failure, but accept responsibility for success. So fundamental attribution area would be to say, if you failed a test, you're going to blame the teacher because the teacher did a bad job explaining things, or the testing room, I don't know, was cold, or there was some irritating sounds in the testing room. So basically, you're attributing your failure to other things other than yourself. Now, of course, if you get the A, you're going to attribute the success to yourself. Right? Okay. The fourth one is displacement. This is also one that I think that you would have heard of before. That is where displacement is when something really upsets you or threatens you or makes you very, very angry, but you cannot be angry with that person. So you take it out on somebody else. You displace your anger. We hear, say, if you've had a really, really bad day at work and you can't yell at your boss or your coworkers, so maybe you come home and you're snapping with your family or you're snapping with your brothers or sisters or whatnot. So that is displacement. Rationalization. Rationalization, well, you're rationalizing, right? You're coming up with a reason for things or an excuse for something that's easier to accept than the real reason. So, trying to think of an example. You're dating somebody, you go out with somebody, you go out a few times, and then that person breaks up with you, and you're like, well, I didn't really care for them that much anyways, or we didn't have that much in common anyways. So you're basically just having reasons that are more acceptable, easier to take than the real reason, which is maybe they weren't just that into you, right? But it's easier to say, we didn't have a lot in common or whatnot. Reaction formation. This is an interesting one. Reaction formation is when you're really angry about something. We're just going to use anger because it's the easiest one. Really angry about something, but you can't show that for whatever reason. So you do the opposite. Okay? So it's that phrase, I think they've got that in here, killing somebody with kindness, right? So you're really angry with somebody, so instead you're just really, really nice. And you're really nice to the point where it's annoying, right? They're talking here, consider a man who's angry with his girlfriend, but the anger is not conscious. He's not aware of how angry he really is. So instead he's just being super, super nice. And here, have the umbrella, right? But you're doing it to the point where, take the umbrella, even though they don't want it. Okay? So you're taking your feelings and it's the opposite. You're rechanneling it in an opposite, nicer way, but is also aggressive. Okay. Projection. This one's interesting as well. Projection is sorry, I'm pausing because I'm trying to think of how to position this. So projection is when you see when somebody's I did this course on something like this where we learned what this means and how we see things in others. So part of the project was, or the workshop was, to think of somebody who sort of rubs you the wrong way, right? You don't, for some reason, you just don't really like them. Or there's parts of them you don't like. And then we analyzed it and we looked at that when there's something or somebody that just rubs you the wrong way, a lot of the time, and we imagine that like little switches on your back, it's because they possess qualities of yourself, of you, that you don't really like, right? Necessarily. So you're projecting onto them that you don't really like them, but it's actually your qualities that you don't like. Okay? So we see in others traits and desires that we find upsetting about ourselves. Because then, if we don't like them, we can just focus on not liking that person, instead of hating ourselves or looking at those qualities of ourselves. I was going to give an example, but I don't want to do that. So, you can just imagine right now, maybe somebody that you know. For me, I guess it would be somebody, I guess maybe bossy or a little bit aggressive, possibly. So I would look at those things and think, wow, okay, am I bossy? Am I a little bit aggressive? So you can sort of reveal things about yourself by looking at people who you find annoying. Okay? All right, that's enough of that. False consensus effect is the tendency to assume that other people are similar to them. So your defense mechanism in a certain situation is, well, everybody's like me. Everybody does that, so it's okay. You're assuming that everybody is like you and everybody has the same traits and the same habits or whatnot, so therefore it's okay. Right? This is an example. I overspend on my credit cards every month, but everybody does that. Like everybody does. That's not true. But that's what you do. Okay? People might say, like, partying on weekends. Everybody parties every weekend. Like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So what's the problem with that? That's not necessarily true. Not everybody parties every Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Not everybody drinks to that extent, so it is rationalizing your behavior by saying everybody else does it. And then finally, sublimation, which Freud says is probably the most adaptive, most healthy defense mechanism that you can have, and that is channeling your anger and your anxiety and channeling those things into something that's more healthy. Okay. It's the most adaptive defense mechanism. It's channeling of unacceptable sexual or aggressive instincts into socially desired activities. So going for a jog, getting into sports. If you're into art, you can start painting. You can... anything that you're doing to channel your energy into those things away from your sexual and aggressive urges. So defense mechanisms, they can be healthy, right? Because the idea is that you are subject to stress and anxiety constantly. There's 1,000 battles you gotta, fight through every single day or every single week, and you can't possibly completely objectively process these every single time. I think you might go crazy, right? So the idea is that the ego is trying to help manage your self-esteem and blows to your self-esteem and blows in anxiety and upset and stress by engaging in these defense mechanisms to sort of manage it. So a little bit is fine. A little bit is fine. What does become a problem, and Freud does exert, is the two biggest things that indicate a healthy life is having healthy relationships and being able to work productively in your life. So as long as you can do those two things very, very well, then you're doing okay. But if your behaviors are if you're engaging in behaviors that you're having to engage in these defense mechanisms constantly, and then your work life is not going smoothly, it's interacting with your work life or it's interacting with your relationships, that's when defense mechanisms are not being used well. They're being abused or over-relied on in an unhealthy way. There we go. I do have a video here. I'm not going to play it on here because it's in the slides. You can watch it if you like. So it is a short, I think it's like 8 or 9 minutes. It's a summary of the analytic approach, so it's a nice little review of the main concepts and how things work. So feel free to enjoy that video. Oop, dang, there we go. Okay, so we did structure of the personality, we did dynamics of personality, and in the next video we're going to start with psychosexual stages of personality development. I will see you there.